Welcome, everyone, to our illustrious keynote. I have the incredible pleasure to interview Cal Henderson here. Cal, I know nobody in the audience doesn't know what Slack is, but can you give the elevator pitch?
Sure. So Slack is a tool, a platform that we built that kind of, at its core, it's a messaging platform for teams, but we really see it as a hub for collaboration inside organizations, inside teams, that brings together both the messaging and the communication aspect and all of the tools that you use to get work done in the workplace across all kinds of sizes of businesses, all kinds of industries, and all kinds of roles.
We use it at the Video Game Museum. The whole thing runs on Slack. Phone messages, emails, Twitter, it all pours into Slack. It's a wonderful collaboration platform.
Yeah, and I think that, the reason that we built it as a product, it's kind of funny that you do the Video Games Museum, is we started out as a gaming company, and ultimately our games didn't work out, but what we did realize over the 4 years that we spent trying to make games was that we wanted to work together in a different way. We wanted to use kind of messaging as the basis of how we collaborated, but also that there was this increasing number of other tools and systems that were where work was happening. And kind of as the kind of modern way of working and interacting with technology has changed over the last decade, there isn't really a kind of center to all of the kind of the apps and platforms and services that you use anymore. So kind of tying that together with messaging was kind of the inspiration behind the product, if you will.
So whenever I do one of these fireside chats, I like to go all the way back. So let's start off with your first computer.
So you might not be able to tell from my seemingly American accent, because I've been here for a while, but actually I'm originally British. And so, yeah, somebody in the audience. And so we had a different set of computers in the UK. So my first computer was a Sinclair Spectrum in the early to mid-'80s, which was a beautiful machine. You loaded games off tapes, it made the screeching sound. You plugged it into your TV. But I think most importantly, from all those kind of first wave of home computers in the 80s was that it came with a basic interpreter. So it's like you got a computer and you got games, but you could make programs. And from like a really young age, I just fell in love with making stuff on a computer. And like previous to that, I'd wanted to be like a pilot or an astronaut. That wasn't going to work out. But then I was like, okay, programming is the thing. I love to just make stuff. So it was just an incredibly, powerful tool in the hands of, a 7, 8-year-old.
So BASIC was your first language?
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's like I thought I was an amazing programmer. I learned all of the 4 or 5 basic words, and I could print text on the screen, make little games, and it really just all started from there.
And was there a particular project that stands out as something you spent a lot of time on?
I spent a lot of time making very shitty games for a long time, and that is definitely a hobby I have kept throughout the whole of my career. I have a huge number of half-finished game projects, which one day I will get back to and finish. But I think a really kind of so programming from a young age, but definitely a pivotal moment for me was in the kind of mid to late mid-90s when I first got on the internet and on the web. And it was a transition from I can make stuff and it's interesting and fun and I like to be creative to I can make things and show them to 50 other people all around the world, some of whom are going to be in other countries in Europe and some of whom will be, off across the ocean in the US. And just that access to audiences and seeing that I can make something and share it with other people immediately around the world, I was like, okay, I'm not sure about this, but I think the web is going to be big. And so at that point, I was just like, I'm all in on making things for the web. And it has turned out all right.
I'd say so. You're responsible for some of the most important apps of the modern era, like Flickr and Slack. Is there any particular project along the way that you have most sentimentality for, or something that maybe you wish had gone farther?
Oh, I mean, I think both Flickr and now Slack came out of failed attempts to make video games. And in both of those cases, I doubt anybody played the first game that we tried to make. It was also why it didn't work out. But that was called Game Never Ending. And I think that's still a project that's like super close to my heart because it was such when I first came across the company that was making it and before I joined, it was like transformational way of using the web, using the internet to have a kind of shared communication play space. And it was kind of the culmination of all the things that I really liked about the internet. in a business that ultimately wasn't actually a successful business and wasn't going to work out, but was just a really interesting use of technology. And that, kind of paved the way for the like successes we did have after that.
Usually I ask if whether our guest or speaker is into VI or Emacs, but you have an interesting answer on text editors.
Oh, so I'm historically super idiosyncratic in a lot of ways that I work. And I've been a Windows user since the 90s. I still use a Windows laptop now, which is like super untrendy amongst this crowd. But for some reason, from like the late 90s onwards, I insisted on using a text editor I wrote myself because it was just the way I wanted it. So like way nerdier than VI or Emacs. But as my kind of like the last decade of my career has progressed, I don't really write code professionally anymore on a day-to-day basis. So like my editor is not hugely important. I use Sublime Text for taking notes now. Go Sublime Text. But I'm not really a VI or Emacs person.
So the thing that I think is you're best known for probably these days, with all the books that you've written and so forth, is extremely scalable systems. And getting those scalable systems up and running in a remarkable time frame. Can you sort of set the stage for that with Slack? Like how much scaling did you go for initially, and did you make the right decisions?
I think it's like a lot of things, it is a spectrum. And on one end, you've got the kind of like MVP, just build something that will just work for your first customer, kind of like YOLO approach to engineering. And on the other end, you have the like super over-engineer, build it assuming that everybody on the planet is going to use it from the first day, like bulletproof, built for scale. And the correct answer, to the extent that there is one, is always somewhere in between the two, and probably starting more on the first end early on, because the most important thing early on when you're building a new product or service is finding that product market fit and being able to iterate rapidly. The first thing that you build, the first thing that you design, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's going to scale up huge, because it's not going to be the right product and people aren't going to use it to begin with. The trick after that is staying far enough ahead of the curve that you're able to, deal with demand. And I guess being outpaced by demand of somebody wanting to use your product or service ahead of your ability to scale is a nice problem to have to begin with, so long as it's not one that kind of cripples you. There aren't that many instances of startup products or services that got overwhelmed with scale and failed as a result. There are many more instances of people that failed to find product market fit, even though they built something that was super robust. But there's there are definitely things that we did that I did at Slack that turned out to be the wrong decisions scale-wise, but that we've been able to deal with over time. I think the biggest one of those is when we first built the product, we imagined that it would be a tool for teams of 5 to 50 people. And so we were like, okay, we envision that many people will use this, but they'll all be on small teams. So we store the data in a certain way. We assume that any individual team can't get too big. And that it was a great problem to have, but that assumption fell down very quickly when we started getting our first customers who had thousands of users, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands in a single instance. We're like, okay, a bunch of our assumptions have been invalidated, and we're going to need to change the way we think about building it. Other than that, the kind of core, there are a few core kind of concepts and principles around building things for scale that are definitely a lot easier to tackle today than they were a decade ago. Things like never assume you have one of any kind of server, always start with 2, and how you'll deal with being able to go from 2 to 3 is much easier than going from 1 to 2. But the kind of tool set from a software point of view, from like bits of software that you use, but also kind of systems design, is just so far along now from where it was a decade, 15 years, 20 years ago, that there's so many more examples that you can draft off of.
Absolutely. Is there anything you wish had existed when you started Slack?
Oh, so many things. I mean, I think we were lucky when we started Slack. Slack's about 6 years old now. That AWS and infrastructure as a service was already very much a thing. It's easy to forget that that's really only been around for about a decade as a thing that people would assume you would use. AWS, GCP, or Azure. Like buying physical servers and putting them in a data center, at a small scale is a horrible nightmare, and at a large scale is a really horrible nightmare and huge capital expense, and just such a huge time suck. So back when we built Flickr, we had a physical data center. We had, our physical servers, which for some reason our data center was on the 21st floor of a tower in Vancouver. And so we'd buy servers and they wouldn't fit in the elevator. And then we needed, we couldn't get things up to the floor and we had to get a crane for some things. And it was all just fucking nightmare. And that was at a point when we had 10 of them. Then we moved to Yahoo through the acquisition and had thousands eventually of servers. And it's we want to add some capacity. We'll have to plan 8 weeks in advance. This hardware is becoming obsoleted. So this is a really long way of saying use AWS. It's fucking amazing compared to what we had to do in the past. So it was great that we had that. But I think what's really happened over the last 5 or 6 years since we built Slack is that a lot of technology has been invented in that short time frame that's really changed the way that people think about different aspects of building technology. A big one for us has been React on the front end. There's been a complete revolution in how people build front ends in the browser. But all of that technology didn't exist when we started Slack. So a lot of that technology that we've had to kind of migrate to and rebuild on top of just didn't exist. So if we're rebuilding the service again today, we'd just be able to make a bunch of technology choices that would be hugely helpful. I mean, Kubernetes is another one of those, and containers in general, that we think about the way we manage our fleet of thousands or tens of thousands of servers in a very different way. And I think part of that is that there's been this big burst of technology over the last 5 years, and the part of that is there's been a big burst of startups that have done an awful lot of the trial and error that you don't want to have to do yourselves, and we can just benefit from the lessons that that those people who have tried and failed or tried and succeeded have learned. And so just the body of knowledge that we can build on top of is so much greater than it was 5 or 6 years ago.
That touches on something we sort of discussed as one of the things you wanted to admonish to this audience, which I believe was to stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
I mean, yeah, it is always the best time to start a technology startup because there is more tools and more knowledge available now than there has been in the past. And that will be the case next week and next month. It's also any time in the past was the best time to do it because then you will have already got there. But I think that the pace of change of innovation in that space has just, of the tools and technologies you can use is just increasing in a tremendous way.
And I mean, you've got to use those tools, not reinvent them, right? Every developer loves throwing everything away and starting over.
Yeah, and I think there's when you're an engineer by trade, you tend to see kind of all problems as can be solved with code and can be solved with engineering, and I'm definitely guilty of this. I go and use our task tracker, and I'm Jira does the job, but what if I just made one that was a bit better? And then you start falling down a hole into definitely our HR system is super janky, and the way people provision laptops is difficult, so maybe we should invest 500 hours in saving half an hour there. And it's a really dangerous hole to fall down, because every problem looks like it can be solved with building software, and we build software, so why not solve all these problems? But I think it's, especially early on, you have to concentrate on what are the things that you want to be unique about? What are the things that set you apart from other businesses and are core to what it is you're building? In our case with Slack, that was the real-time messaging delivery service, because that's kind of the key bit that sets us apart from most other things. So we'll invest a bunch in building that. Everything else we'll use off the shelf. When you're a young startup, that is not the right time to build your own version of Linux or write your own database or write your own web server. It's 10 years down the road, if you're a hugely successful company, that could be the right time to go do those things. But early on, you have a limited number of innovation points you can spend on things, and make sure those are the things that are really core to what you're doing that nobody else is.
One of the things that people frequently cite as Google or Facebook's secret sauce for developers is the speed of their build time, to be able to see that sort of immediate feedback loop into whether the thing that you did worked or not. Can you talk about how you build and test over at Slack?
No, I have long been a fan of very untrendy technology, PHP, which we used previously, because of that developer loop. The idea that you write some code and it runs immediately. There's no long compile step. Same thing with JavaScript in the browser before we had transpilation, was you make a change, you immediately see that change. And that kind of, that immediate feedback loop during the development cycle is huge. And on larger scales as well, the faster you can iterate with customers and the faster you can get things into the hand of customers, the faster you can make feedback on those changes. So any loop that you can get smaller, whether that is literally you write a line of code and you're able to see the results, or you're able to release changes to customers. It's one of the reasons why I personally find mobile development super frustrating, because that loop is always so long. But we put a lot of time into driving down that kind of cycle time for mobile as well. The quicker we can get those builds and the quicker we can get things into people's hands, then the more that you can iterate on things.
Is that worth spending engineering time on fixing?
At some point. That's not the thing you go and do day one. The thing you do day one is you're building it by yourself, so you don't need your CI/CD for your mobile apps because you're the sole developer and you're building it in Xcode or whatever. And I think that understanding when those kind of optimizations are the right thing to invest in is pretty important. When you get to that scale of the number of developers working on a code base or a service where it makes sense to start optimizing for those things. That's a difficult one. It's going to super vary by the nature of your product and the size of your team and things like that.
Just as an example, you have 10 million daily active users now. At what point on the way to that number did build and test and that pipeline become something that you were willing to invest engineering dollars?
I think that's always something we've invested on a kind of percentage basis. Now that we have a lot more employees, we went over 1,000 employees quite a while ago. That's something that we really think about as a percentage investment of how much do you spend on, essentially the productivity of your own engineers. Engineers, I love them, bless them. They're crazy expensive. They're a big expense for your business. So how can you get the most out of that? Whether that is your deploy cycle, your build times, your feedback times. Being able to rapidly deploy has always been a big thing for us from the very beginning. With our core services, we make sure that we're able to do that kind of at will as fast as possible to keep those loops really tight.
With all those users, is there some kind of playbook you go by for those deployments? Just as an example, Verizon had an 80-page document for years you had to go through. Obviously it's not that.
I think that there's definitely multiple schools of thought there on the spectrum between because we're an enterprise software company, but a fairly unique one. There's the kind of spectrum between we release software once or twice a year, and it's an incredible event that involves the whole company and a month of hand wringing and nail-biting fear, or we release multiple times a day, and every one of those we get incredibly practiced at it, and there's an awful lot of tooling and automation around it. We're definitely more towards the latter. We have an incredible amount of automation around it, de-risking each release and making it as simple as possible. Because it's something that we repeat again and again and learn from, that we remove the risk. We try and remove as much of the risk as possible from each time we do that.
So that leads into the idea of scaling the people behind all of this software development. As everybody in this room, I hope, knows, the more people you throw at a software project, the slower it goes. So how do you fix that?
Well, I don't think that's fixable on a fundamental level. But there should hope. That rule kicks in at a certain point. It's definitely not the case that the fastest possible you can build software is with one person. So there's always, some kind of trade-off there. And I think that as our organization has grown, there are really a bunch of inflection points at which you have to throw away the process of how you work together and kind of rethink it for that scale. And there's the Rakuten CEO has this rule of 3 and 10, that each time you multiply the scale by 3 or 10 is an inflection point. So it's you start with a couple of people, you get to 10, you get to 30, you get to 100, you get to 300. Those are the kind of times at which you have to rethink your process and be willing to throw away the way that you work. The biggest change is really in the complexity of communication and coordination. I feel like we have an advantage because we use Slack, and Slack is a helpful tool for doing that communication and collaboration amongst a group of people, but still human communication is just hard. Tools help facilitate that, but it's still moving humans and getting humans to do things in concert is a big challenge. The other piece of that is that the kind of employees and the kind of employee profile that you want at an earlier stage high growth startup is that you want people who are very open to change. Like change is super tough for human beings. Especially when it's, you're in a role, you kind of get into a groove of feeling like you know how to operate, and as soon as you kind of feel comfortable with it, it's time for that to change. It's very difficult for people. I have found that difficult myself. I'm an engineer. I'm like historically super rigid. It's like, this is exactly what I do. This is exactly how I work. And as the company got bigger very rapidly, I had to more or less constantly be kind of like rethinking what my role is, what I spend any amount of time doing. And my role has changed massively over the last 6 years. Like, I don't write code anymore. And that was a big part of, my identity for a long time, was like, I'm an engineer. I type words into a computer and things come out. And now, I spend a lot of my time talking to people instead. And so that just dealing with that change as you reach those scale points of knowing that we'll have to change the way we work together, we'll have to change more or less all of our processes and build those up over time. Like, it's a lot like, the software architecture, in the sense that you don't start out, if you're a 10-person company, you don't start out with all of the kind of process and human architecture that you would when you're a 1,000-person company. You don't do that kind of over-engineering because it won't work. But similarly, you can't keep the way you worked at 10 people together when you're 1,000 people. That also won't work. So it's an evolution, just like on the kind of technical architecture side.
So I grew up on IRC. I know you did too. What is it about Slack that made it the perfect thing to take over for sort of this janky thing we'd all been using for 20 years?
I think it's a confluence of a few different factors kind of happening around the same time. One of those is the rise of SaaS in the workplace, the switch to businesses using SaaS, but also the massive proliferation of tools that caused. Because of, SaaS as a delivery mechanism massively lowered the cost of doing a startup, as I'm sure a lot of you know. The capital cost to get started are just a lot lower. So we see a lot more kind of niche bits of software become economically viable that weren't a decade ago. The result of this is this massive proliferation of tools. The average enterprise now uses more than 1,000 different software tools to get work done. And that sounds insane. I mean, it is insane. And then I didn't believe it, and we looked internally at Slack, and at the scale we're at, we use 400 different software vendors to get our work done. And it's hard to imagine, 400 different tools to use as a developer, but it's all aspects of the business run everything through software now. So it's like our space planning for seating, and 20 different finance tools for projection, and legal document management tools. And basically every business process now has a niche bit of SaaS. So there's been this proliferation of software, businesses using more and more tools. So that's one aspect. The other one is kind of the rise of messaging in the consumer space. You don't send email to your friends and family anymore to organize going out in the evening. You use SMS, you use Facebook Messenger, you use WhatsApp. And so people are used to a different kind of messaging outside of email. And I think the kind of third aspect has been because of the rise of mobile and smartphones and the kind of bring your own device model inside the workplace, that people have started to expect that the tools they use in the workplace are a similar kind of consumer experience. That is to say that they are a really good user interface and an enjoyable experience, and the software is well built and built with the end user in mind. That's not how enterprise software used to work. It's being sold to the CIO, it's being sold to purchasing, it's not being sold to the end user. And when we built Slack, we came at it from the point of view of, don't really know anything about enterprise software, but we know how to build consumer experiences. So if we just built an end user consumer experience that people really like to use, then maybe that would work. So that, together with messaging being more accepted, but then tying into all of those bits of software that the modern companies are using. So starting to communication being the best place to bring together all of those different tools that you're using.
Excellent. We have about 5 minutes left here, so I thought I'd delve into a few more esoteric questions, like, what's your favorite video game?
Well, I have kids now, so I'm not able to play video games anymore. Hopefully, when they get a bit older. But that's a tough one. When I say that we previously, made video games, and we tried to before we were making Slack or before we were making Flickr, it wasn't like the get points, run around, shoot people kind of games. It was more kind of. This is the reason why it was unsuccessful. Hard to describe kind of hippie collaborative play spaces. And so I think that my interests definitely run in that direction. So I'm a huge fan of Animal Crossing, and I'm incredibly excited for it to come out on the Switch this year.
There we go. Excellent. Can you tell us about maybe one or two of your favorite programming books, influential books that you've read?
I'm not a big. I went to school to do computer science, but I'm not really a big computer theory kind of person. I was really into it and still into it for the creating things that people use. And I think that I'm a very originally self-taught, hands-on kind of programmer, and that's also how I like to continue to find out about new technology. There's nothing like just actually trying to build things, to learn a new technology or to understand a technique. And I think that that also with the kind of the rise of the web really has killed the idea of reading books about computers for me anymore. Although Soul of a New Machine is such a great book about building computers.
What would you hope changes for developers in the future? Is there any kind of one of the things with Glitch is you're trying to sort of enable development for the masses a little bit, right? So.
I think that it's clearly becoming more. Software is becoming more and more embedded in everything we do. You definitely see this when we talk about the 1,000 different apps that are being used inside an enterprise. It's every business process and everything that happens, in the workplace is now intermediated by software. And so as it becomes higher and higher leverage, and more kind of organizations become software organizations, I think it's a more important skill than ever before. It used to be that there were companies and there were software companies that sold software to those companies, but now we definitely see this with our customers. All of our customers, beyond any certain size, are developers themselves. They're building things internally to glue together their apps, to build custom things for them. And so this kind of proliferation of software into every single industry, I think is, to me, hugely exciting, but is also a big opportunity to, bring a lot more people kind of into the fold of, building software engineering, as a career.
Excellent. Is there something you would like young developers to bring when they come in for an interview at Slack? Is there any kind of advice you can give?
I think that as we talked about, the technology, the kind of pace of change of technology and tools is so rapid that it used to, back a decade or 2 decades ago, it was really about do you know this particular technology, or do you have experience in doing this particular thing? And it was much more these are the DBAs and these are the back-end developers. And I think that that as the rate of change of technology growth has continued, that it's not realistic for for people to know exact technologies anymore, and we don't expect that anyone we hire has necessarily used the exact tech stack that we're building on, or has experience in the exact domain that we're building in. And it's much more about kind of 2 aspects. One is that there's a willingness to learn a whole bunch of new technologies, because the technologies that are important to us today are not going to be the ones that are important a decade from now. There's a lot of core concepts that don't really change, but now we're React and Kubernetes and Vitess, and we use Hacklang, which is Facebook's weird PHP typed fork. And they're not going to be the important thing a decade from now. So it's really a willingness to change and adapt. And the other one, which I think is super important, is kind of systems thinking about how systems work and talk together. Because everything is also becoming distributed systems. Software is all about network systems talking to each other, whether that's within the thing you're building or the just massive ecosystem of tools that any company is using that all talk to each other. So those.
Okay, well, 1 minute left. Last question. You mentioned JavaScript, you mentioned PHP, you mentioned BASIC. Is there a favorite programming language, even though you don't program anymore for a living?
Oh, for me, I don't know. I still hold like a real passion in my heart for Perl, which is the first language that I built a lot of stuff on the web for. It's a horrible language to learn or read or use, but I just feel like strong affinity for it. Yeah, so don't get into Perl in any way, but I feel a strong tie to it. So
it's apparently being updated.
Perl 6 coming out any decade now.
Yeah, a couple decades. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Cal, thank you for being here. This has been fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.